And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our very special guest, well known to our network, is Dr. William A. Donohue. And the book is Sense Catholicism, How to Solve Our Cultural Crisis, published by Ignatius Press. And of course, well known as
Thank you so much.
Man in charge of the Catholic League, who's been leading the charge and defending the faith over many, many years. I mean, before I came to EWTN,
26
you were
years
doing
now.
it, right?
Yeah.
So exactly. I remember on Long Island when you were there. Now, so this is Sense Catholicism. So is this based on Chesterton, or what is this about?
Well, certainly Chesterton is one of the ones who understood that we're not talking here about all intellectuals. We're talking here about the blue sky people, those who reject human nature and nature's God. They're found overwhelmingly in the social sciences and the humanities. And look, Doug, I've taught every grade from the second grade through newly minted PhDs from around the world in the Fulbright program. I've met a lot of good professors, but I've also met a lot of them who are plainly dysfunctional in their own lives, and they're dysfunctional in terms of the ideas they give to our culture. And they've done a lot of damage. And the Catholic Church has teachings. It's a repository of wisdom. We have the answers. People need to consult them.
Now, you say in the beginning, survey shows most American people believe we're going in the wrong direction. You say it wasn't always that way. It doesn't have to be that way. But then you say to understand what ails us, we need to put aside the notion that our problems are fundamentally political and economic in nature. Then what are they?
Social and cultural, without question. We have a functioning democracy. It's under assault in many quarters, but it still works. People are crashing our borders, not because they like Hollywood, but because they want some of the economic prosperity which a market economy generates. But socially and culturally, our house is not in good order. The family is not in good order. Right. If you take a look at the norms and values, you take a look at suicide and adolescent pregnancies, and you take a look at dropouts and the like, there are a lot of problems. Narcissism has now become almost fashionable in many respects. I think a lot of people understand the problem, that there is a problem out there. They don't understand why. And unfortunately, it's like going to a doctor. If he has a wrong diagnosis, he's going to make the patient worse. Right. And this is what happens when you have a lot of these blue sky intellectuals.
Right.
They give the wrong advice, and boy,
well, you
it
say
pays.
That. Well, you use that example in the book, and also later on you also talk about the idea that every time they try these policies that fail, their answer is to do more of it. It's
astonishing to me that you have a guy like Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, my city, and he says Bloomberg, the previous mayor, was wrong. Bloomberg said that if you had failing public schools, you get less money. De Blasio said that's not the way to do it. You give them more money. You give more money to failure, because that way it's all about money. See, money makes people equal, and that makes them do well in school. So he spent $839 million over 3 years and on 94 of the worst schools in New York City. At the end of the 3-year period, 91 of them had failed to meet their benchmark. Now, I know as an educator that the most important determinant of academic achievement is not the school. I'm not saying it doesn't count. It's the family. It's what you bring to the school. You have Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook genius. He says it's just a matter of money, so we just write a check. I'm going to give $200 million to Newark, and we'll make the schools good. I'll put up $100 million, or half the amount myself, and I'll raise the other 100. What happened? Nothing worked. As soon as the teachers' unions found out, they took off 40% of all the money had to go to back pay. Then they went into the consultants at $1,600 an hour. I mean, the idea that writing a check it can bring about academic achievement is crazy. Catholic schools do well with low budgets because we focus on the basics. And the thing is this: every existing inequality is not an example of an inequity. That's what's taught in the schools. So that if some group, some demographic group does better than another, instead of making the one that's not doing well, make them better, we want to bring down the top. That's why the Asians are being discriminated against in New York City, and that's why they're suing Harvard University, good for them, because they say we have too many Asians who are doing well. That's not the way to correct the situation. Work with the bottom and bring them to the top. Don't take the top and bring them to the bottom.
The old defining deviancy.
Well, that's exactly what they're doing, what Moynihan said. Exactly.
Years and years ago. And you also said the first thing we need to realize, so this is good, is that bad things are not always the result of bad people. Stupid people, yes, but not necessarily bad people.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people that I've met in academia, I don't think that they will, that minorities, for example, don't do well in school, to take the education example again. But they don't understand what makes for academic achievement. They are plainly stupid because they don't have common sense. And that's the definition that I have in the book, of course, is that the lack of common sense really is an example of stupidity. If I don't know how to make a hard-boiled egg, it doesn't mean I'm stupid. It means I haven't learned how to do it or something of that nature.
Right.
So now there are people I do think are malicious. I don't want to, but I would not say that's I wouldn't say that's the majority of them. I would say people who believe, no, we all have to come together as one big family, and you know what? I want equality between men and women, and so therefore, men and women are totally equal in everything. Well, they're not equal in everything. First of all, you have to recognize that there is a man and there is a woman. Women are better at detail and remembering things than men. Men are better at spatial relations. That doesn't make the men better. It doesn't make the woman better. It makes them different. But we don't want to acknowledge that in our society. So we don't even, now we're at the point where we don't even recognize it's just men and women. There's all kinds of these gender groups out there.
I mean, you're on the cutting edge, but aren't even you surprised at how quickly we've gotten here now?
Yes. And I'm a sociologist. I've been studying it for many decades. Yes, it's picked up at a rapid pace. It's at a gallop pace now. This is what happens when a society loses its Judeo-Christian moorings. So what's to take its place? Secularism. What's that about? It's about the individual. You know, you take the example of freedom, which I have in the book. The Catholic Church's idea of freedom is profoundly countercultural. It's one of the most countercultural ideas in our modern time. The idea that freedom is the right to do what you ought to do. That's what the Catechism teaches. That's what St. John Paul II taught. Now, in our society, the idea of freedom is about the other. That's heresy. Freedom is about me. It's what I want to do with my body. I can dump any kind of drug into my body, sex with anybody I want as many times as I want, and I shouldn't get any STDs. And if I do get STDs, I want the government to come in and solve it.
Must be somebody else's fault.
It's got to be somebody else's fault. It'd be like smokers, chain smokers, saying, let's have a march on Washington. Somebody's got to do something about lung cancer.
Well,
but don't ask me to change.
Well, it's interesting because you make a large point of that whole idea of how the press and the government was very good on things with cigarettes and things like that, but when it came to AIDS, they were caught in this kind of dichotomy.
Right, exactly. And the thing is, you know, look, AIDS didn't come about because of some strange bug, okay? You have to do, it's a behavioral achievement in most cases. I remember, Doug, going back to circa 1990, it was 89, 90, 91, I'm on with Larry King, who I liked, actually. He was a very good interviewer. And I was on with this one gay activist. And we got talking about this. AIDS was discovered in 1981. That put the brakes on the sexual revolution. And so he was saying, you know, the gay guy was saying, well, anybody can get AIDS. And I said, no, I can't get it. I said, I can't get it, not unless I get a blood transfusion. You know why? Because I don't sleep around, I don't practice a certain kind of sex, and I don't take drugs. All right? So I have a better chance of getting AIDS, getting hit by lightning in Central Park than I do. He said, no, that's not true. Well, unfortunately for that poor man, 2 years later, he died of AIDS, which Foucault, the great French intellectual, says that's not a disease. He raped boys. He's the great intellectual from France, Foucault. He raped boys, had sex with all kinds of men. He says this is a lie put out by heterosexuals, homophobic. AIDS is a social construction. Guess what he died of? A social construction.
Yeah, if it's possible. Right. Well, a lot of times it's kind of that same idea, this theoretical sense that anybody can get something. It's like telling women, as we talk about in here, don't worry, you can have children anytime. There's no reason you can't have a child at 40. We didn't tell you it would be more difficult or you'd have more miscarriages. But theoretically, there's no reason you couldn't.
Now, see, now people who have common sense, which is most people, they already kind of instinctively know this. Cardinal Dolan asked me about the book, interviewed me recently. He said, well, Bill, how are you going to change these intellectuals? I said, Cardinal Dolan, it's not meant for them. I've given up on these people. I really have. The great wizards, the geniuses who have created so many of our problems. This is meant for the large swath of the public. And you don't have to be Catholic to like this book. It's about people who already have some common sense, but they're beginning to doubt themselves because they hear all these strange ideas all the time. And I'm saying, don't double question yourself. Go with your instincts. You know that the Catholic teachings are a repository of wisdom. If you listen to this nonsense, you will begin to self-doubt on these things. Common sense is something you got to rely on. I'm not against knowledge or anything of that nature. No, I got a PhD. But that's overrated. A lot of these people are promoting madness, and that's the word I want to use. It's madness to believe that a man could be a woman and vice versa, that every form of inequalities and inequity, that we should tear up our Judeo-Christian ethos for what?
Or the story about a man who was having a baby. And it was insane, and then complaining over the fact of how he was treated or not treated because of how he identified himself.
What about the president of Smith College today in 2019? The president. She says that motherhood is a cultural invention. No, that's a fiction, people. Right. It's not a cultural invention. See, Doug, what I do in the book is...
Right, you even talk specifically about the difference between motherhood and fatherhood.
Exactly. Right. And there are, I look at the work of Donald Brown. He's a great anthropologist. He said there are over 300 human universals or 300 human properties or attributes or characteristics which are true in every society in the history of the world. He's talking about what nature ordains to society, such as, obviously, the mother's closer to the child than the father. Why? Because she gives birth and he does not. Right. Now, if you have common sense, you already know that. This is being challenged in the schools. This is being challenged. And so these kids are coming out of the school thinking, am I crazy or what? No, your professor is crazy, all right? They're living in the world of fiction. This is delusion. And I, quite frankly, am fed up with it. I've taught all these, every grade, as I say, that you can teach. And as I say, there are a lot of good professors out there, but some of them are absolutely mad.
Well, one of the points you made I thought was interesting in the sense you even said there's some people who you think are teaching because they can't function anywhere else.
Well, I've seen that. They can barely get through the day themselves. I mean, the old saw about those who can't do, teach. Yeah, they'll teach. I think that's unfair because a lot of good teachers are out there, particularly in the elementary and secondary grades. But a lot of the ones in the social sciences, humanities, I don't know how they get through the day. I mean, they live a kind of a world of hypocrisy too, because I know that these feminist professors I used to see telling the girls, you've got to stand up to the men and whatnot. But I know about that person because I'm on the faculty. Her husband treats her like dirt all the time, but she can't stand up to him. So she uses the classroom as a projection and then gets into the man-hating routine. It's this kind of thing is much more common than people want to realize.
Well, you said it's kind of Orwellian, and you quote Orwell, who says, one has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool. And then you also say, the highly educated tend to overanalyze events, employing abstract ideas to think about human behavior.
Right. I mean, again, let's get back to STDs, for example. People say, well, we need more education, and we need more abortion, and we need more contraception. Well, hello, people. Just think about this. Let's turn the clock back to the 1950s. Abortion was illegal until '73. The birth control pill didn't come on the market until 1960. Sex education didn't hardly exist in the 1950s. What kind of a problem do we have with STDs? Minimal, minimal. Now we have abortion on demand. Now we have contraceptions and condoms all over the place. We have sex education of the most progressive sort. And we have a major problem with sexually transmitted diseases. They just don't get it. If you look, it happened in the church. Let's face it, in the 1970s, in a lot of the seminaries, they dropped their guard. Right. That's when we had the problem. People say, no, it was the church's teaching on sexuality were too restrictive. Well, they were pretty restrictive in the 50s, and we didn't have this problem. When they took the lid off in the 60s, and particularly the 70s, that's when people started acting out who had some sexual dysfunction. So you don't make things better that way. Again, we keep thinking it's more money, it's more technology, it's more ideas. No, common sense will tell you restraint. If you don't want to exercise restraint and you want to be promiscuous with money, with food, with drugs, with sex, you're going to pay a price for it. Right. But that's what's happened to our society. They don't want to talk about the pendulum in the middle.
You talk about getting human nature right. If there's one subject that's delighted intellectuals throughout the ages, it's the making of a good society. We can all agree the rallying cry of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, is about ends that most people want. And you point out about the French Revolution. In fact, you break the book up in that particular way. And then you make the point that is so right on the money that, in my mind all the time, Catholicism understands original sin. These people don't believe in original sin.
No, they're guilty of what the Catholic Church calls the sin of pride. They reject human nature, and they reject nature's God. They're too smart to believe in God. That's for the fools out there in the hinterland to believe in God. And that's why they look down on us. And now they're not just looking down on us, now they're warring on us. And they think that they can figure everything out. See, if there's no such thing as human nature, that means we're all like a little bit of silly putty. You can just bend and shape and do whatever you want. And of course, they'll do that. They'll be at the command center. Or at least they'll give the ideas to the social engineers who will change us all. Well, it never works. It always backfires anyway. They always lose. because they lost their common sense. And if they did believe in human nature, which is a constant, it's not something new, it's not a social construction. What we see in the culture is what nature ordains. The culture is following nature. That's why in the chapter there, Doug, I call it sex equality, not gender equality. Right. Gender means socially learned norms and values that are appropriate for the boys and girls. Well, the reason why boys are more aggressive than girls is because we have more testosterone. Right. That doesn't make us better, it makes us different. But now you can't even mention that. That would be considered a, quote, microaggression in the colleges and universities. So now you have to go to the safe spot. There are safe zones in many colleges and universities where you can have free speech. You can talk about something controversial, such as only a man and a woman should get married. But you have to go to a certain spot. That's why I've often said to people, there's more common sense and there's more freedom of speech in your local pub than there is in your local college campus.
Right, and you also make the point in chapter having to do with liberty, and we talked about, you were talking about, in a sense, radical autonomy. The Freudian appeal is evidenced by our preoccupation with autonomy. Pop culture has been promoting radical autonomy since the 60s, and you go on to talk about this and about the Founding Fathers and where they come out as opposed to Freud. But one of that's interesting, you still hear in the church, you don't hear as much coming out of the 60s and 70s of Freud, but you heard a lot about Jung. You talk about Jung in the book.
Jung hated Catholics, hated the Catholic Church, so did Freud. Their idea of sexual freedom was let the libido run wild. Otherwise, we're going to be repressed. Well, if that's the example of freedom, then Hollywood should be a lot of free souls. Why are they always going to morgues? Why are they always into another marriage? Why are they always unhappy? Why are they always going to psychiatrists? Why are they so dysfunctional? They're free spirits, but why aren't they happy? That's the question then. You know, I looked at a previous book, The Catholic Advantage, and I looked at the cloistered nuns. Now, they're supposed to be very unhappy according to this idea of freedom. They're the happiest people and they live longer. Now, we've been sold a bill of goods for too long, and I worry about the kids in the colleges and universities who've been sold this nonsense by these professors. They know instinctively, the kid does, it doesn't sound right, but then they go into the next class and it's reinforced again. But these people, by the way, don't like their ideas challenged. They don't want to be challenged. You know, remember the TV, we used to have Crossfire? I cut my teeth on that. Hanny and Combs. You don't see liberal conservative debates anymore. Why? Because the liberals didn't do well against the conservatives. Not just against me, but against conservatives in general. Why? We have experience and common sense on our side. They don't. And when they're confronted with that, they just crash.
Well, it seems to be like somebody once pointed out the fact that they tend to focus on good intentions as opposed to actual results.
Well, I think we're a little bit past that. If my daughter goes to a doctor to be operated on a serious procedure, and he had good intentions, but he screws up and he kills her, I'm not going to be saying, well, you know, he just made a mistake, he meant well. I mean, at some point, we've got to say, folks, time out. If the people who scream the loudest about helping the poor always wind up hurting them, the Castro did it, he killed the poor, but yet he wore the uniform, okay? He was a lawyer, he was a middle-class guy. The Sandinistas did the same thing. We're seeing the same thing in the Democratic Party right now. Many of these people screaming for more equality are filthy rich according to the way they would determine things, and yet they're saying we should take more money from one group. De Blasio came out just last week and said, you know what, people say there's not enough money to fix these problems. Yes, there is. There's plenty of money. It's just that it's in the wrong hands.
Well, it's interesting, too, because what used to be seen Wall Street as being a big Republican thing is really a very much of a Democratic.
Listen, when it comes particularly when it comes to matters sexual, Wall Street, led by Goldman Sachs, and the corporate world, the Fortune 500, they are totally involved in the whole gay trans movement in this country. You couldn't have pulled it off without them. They're very much into that game. And so, you know, people really have to trust their own instincts again and their common sense. Don't look to the elites for wisdom. You can get it in the church, but you can't get it outside too often.
Well, I have to bring this up because I always had so much respect. Monsignor William Smith, who taught young men for decades in St. Joseph's Seminary in New York, took apart the abortion stance with precision. He said, human rights do not rest on consensus. Respect for human rights of blacks, Jewish people, any minority does not rest on consensus. That's why we call them inalienable rights.
Right. There are inalienable rights which are not open for vote, and there are also what the Catholic Church calls intrinsic evils. Not every sin is equal. Abortion is intrinsically evil. That's different from other kinds of sins. There's a hierarchy here. There's a hierarchy of truths. But you see, what's under attack, of course, is the whole concept of truth. Right. The postmodernists say there's no such thing as truth. As I've pointed out many times in the past, one person who agreed with them, with the people on the left, was Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. He explicitly said, there's no such thing as truth. And of course, once you believe that, right, then it's all a matter of opinion. So you're
Pontius Pilate had questions about that too, right?
He had a few questions
about truth.
That's the classic example.
Right, exactly. I thought it was also Veritatis Splendor. You thought about what a great document, how important that was, and that understanding of that there is a truth and there's a right and wrong. You also say for many modern Americans, ordered liberty is an oxymoron. What do you mean?
Yeah, I was. We wined and dined a number of years ago by some people who call themselves communitarians. And they were very skittish about religion, but they did understand what was happening with sexual problems and with drug and alcohol abuse and things of this nature. They knew that the ACLU had gone too far. And I had written 2 books on the ACLU, so they came to me. And with the exception of myself and Linda Chavez, who's Catholic, when we got to this subject here, when I mentioned the word ordered liberty to them, they still kind of winced. I don't like the idea liberty has to be ordered. Well, if it's not ordered, then it's pretty much individualized. And when that happens, look out, because that guy's liberty may actually erode your own. Right. So when people say, well, we should legalize all these drugs, I say, yeah, you can do that as long as you're living in a neighborhood where only a few are taking it. There's always a tipping point, Doug. Mm-hmm. It might be 5% of the neighborhood, 10%, 15%. It's interesting to me as a sociologist that African Americans are more opposed to the legalization of marijuana than white people, because they're saying, for decades you told us to tell our kids to get off drugs. Now we want to legalize it. It's easier. You're less harassed in New York, I can tell you that, if you smoke marijuana than you do Marlboro. Right. I mean, that's just how far gone the whole thing has gone. Right. Look, if a person self-destructs, he doesn't just affect himself, he affects those people around him, his family, his neighbors. Right. So if you have more and more people self-destructing, what's that do to society?
Now, did you see the Jerry Springer, the opera?
Yes, I did. I didn't see it in person. Right. We got the DVD. Right. It is amazing the celebration of perversity that I've seen. But I love what how they end it, that there's no such thing as right and wrong, there's no such thing as good and evil. Let me tell you something. That is the most pernicious idea you can come up with, because now you are left without a defense, aren't you? Because if you wanted to say, well, you don't believe in slavery, but I do, and it's my right, and you have no idea. If I want to kill the child, even after the child is born. I mean, we have Peter Singer. He's a Princeton professor. He's the father of animal rights, and he thinks it's okay for parents to kill their child if they think the child is defective, long after the child is born. Now, this is madness. And people are willing to be intellectually seduced, because as long as it comes back to me, if I feel freer, I'm not worried about the social consequences on somebody else. It's what I want. And if I do get a disease, I want you to fix it, and I want you to come up with the money.
Well, is there some sort of understanding, well, if I don't give you a hard time about the things you're doing wrong, you don't have to give me a hard time about the things I'm doing wrong. So we'll kind of work that way. The other thing is, here you say, there is a popular conception we cannot legislate morality. We hear that all the time. You say this isn't wrong, it's just plain stupid. Well, how do you do that then?
Well, the law is nothing but the repository of morality. What else could it be? Seat belts in a car. You can debate whether or not we should have them or not. It's an example of a morality encoded in law. The same is true of the laws on murder or anything. The question is not whether and people say to me, well, you don't want the law in the bedroom, do you? Well, do you believe in spousal rape laws? That's the law in the bedroom, right? The husband does not have a right to beat his wife to death. So
that's just people quoting Phil Donohue, I think.
Yeah. I knew Phil quite well. When I used to go on the show, I said, Phil, I'm not related to you either ideologically or biologically.
Right. You say it is impossible to hate Western civilization without hating the Judeo-Christian ethos that undergirds it. To be more specific, such a hatred leads inexorably to the loathing of Catholicism, much of the greatness of Western civilization. You also go on to say multiculturalism is not about unity, it's about separation.
It is. It's about dividing people, and it's about an attack on Western civilization. Remember back in 1888, Jesse Jackson went out to Stanford University, and he was out there chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go."
Right?
Okay, let's get rid of Western culture. That's what the Catholic Church built, the idea that men and women are equal before the law and before God and our standard of justice. What do you want to trade it in for? Do you want the Chinese-Japanese version? Well, there was no word for the word freedom in the Chinese and Japanese language until the 19th century.
Point that out.
Do you want to? What about the Muslim world? Should we recommend that? Africa, Latin America. What do you want to recommend to us? I mean, the fact of the matter is we have our imperfections. We got rid of slavery here in 1865 and made it illegal. They didn't make it illegal in Africa until 1981. And it still exists in Somalia and Mauritania. So I mentioned Somalia because we have a gal who's in the Congress today who's telling us how bad America is. We rescued her out of Somalia.
Right, it's amazing with things like that. And just before we go, I thought that was interesting. Self-actualization. All of us who grew up heard about Maslow, taking the extremes that Maslow and Rogers, Carl Rogers, of course, it is neither normal nor helpful. You also say they are not a prescription for emancipation, but rather an invitation to self-destruction and social discord. Is that what we're seeing then?
That's what we're seeing on a wide scale. It's become a mass scale at this point. It's mass narcissism. Christopher Lasch, a man of the left, wrote a book back in the 70s called The Culture of Narcissism. It's only gotten worse. The answer is in the Catholic tradition, the Judeo-Catholic tradition. The fact that some people in our tradition didn't behave well is a result of them departing from the teachings. They didn't conform to the teachings. The teachings are not wrong. Some of the teachers may have been wrong.
Right, exactly. Very good. Thank you so much, Bill Donohue. Common Sense Catholicism, How to Resolve Our Cultural Crisis.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate you dropping by and also being on EWTN as well, EWTN Live. Dr. William A. Donohue of the Catholic League. Common Sense Catholicism, How to Solve Our Cultural Crisis. Very readable and available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Highly recommended. Join us next time right here on Bookmark. Thank you.